When we talk about the prosperous times of the 1920s, we're not leaving out African Americans. Economic opportunity was improving lives for many African Americans as well. World War I had a major impact on that improvement. Over 300,000 African Americans served during World War I. They were a vital part of winning that war. And when the war was being fought, and all those American industries were producing all of that stuff, all those resources, supplies, weapons, guns, uniforms, all that kind of stuff, well, those factories needed workers, and a lot of African Americans from the South migrated or moved to the North to get those jobs. It was known as the Great Migration. Over 2 million African Americans moved from the South to the big cities of the North to acquire or take advantage of those job opportunities. Most of them were in the big cities, and so a lot of African Americans settled in those big cities, especially New York City and especially the Harlem neighborhood, which is in one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. It is one of the world's largest black urban communities during that time. And with this many people that were coming from a very similar background and a similar experience and a similar struggle, it led to a lot of artistic, creative output. And it became known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is a literary and artistic movement that was celebrating African American culture. And so again, there was just this explosion of creativity and artistic celebration. This right here is an image of the Cotton Club, which was a really famous music club, jazz club. And many of the famous musicians of the time played there. Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway and Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith and on and on and on. We'll come back to music later on. Of course, painting and visual art was also a big part of this Renaissance. You see here bright colors, exaggerated figures, exaggerated movements, celebrating all parts of culture and life. There's a lot of authors and poets that also kind of got their start or became known because of this movement. Langston Hughes was probably the movement's best known poet. His poems describe the difficult lives of working class African Americans. He wrote plays and stories, and a lot of his poetry was set to the tempo and the rhythm of music, especially jazz music. It was beautiful to hear. You should look up some Langston Hughes to hear him speaking this poetry, but making it sound like the flow and the movement of music. Zora Neale Hurston was one of the authors and poets of the time. She was also a singer. Her work portrayed the lives of poor Southern African Americans, which was an experience that she was familiar with. She was extremely gifted, she was flamboyant, she was controversial, but she was definitely original. She wrote well over 50 books, and most notably was the book called Their Eyes Were Watching God. And EB Dubois, who we've heard about before, first name William, so William Dubois, he founded the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was in 1909. We've heard about him quite a bit throughout history. He's been mentioned multiple times. He really urged African Americans to protest against racial violence. He wanted to use peaceful protest, and he was a large advocate for equal rights. So just a few examples of some of the people that came out of the Harlem Renaissance, a bit about the Great Migration, and a bit about life for African Americans during the 1920s. And one thing we didn't really get to is jazz music. It's such a big topic that I want to save that for another time. So we'll get back to jazz music later on. See you next time.